Hello and welcome back everyone, we Weeb Online, and today I'm gonna continue the story What If Naruto Mastered How to Edit Seals Part 19. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up, and to watch more videos like this, subscribe to my channel and turn that bell notification on so you never miss an upload. Now wasting no more time, let's begin.
Pale fingers gently cupped the chins of the ichabai and turned them around so they could see him. Naruto briefly wondered if all Biju could take on human forms and if it was likely that the form he was seeing was really Gara's mother. At the very least, it made sense that Gara's mother was actually his own mother. He realized that he didn't know the woman's name, and for a moment he wondered if Mito had a real name that she hadn't stolen by using her preferred form. Amethyst's eyes met the Biju's indigo, at least in this form, and he smiled slightly. Come on, a woman of your rank shouldn't be lying in the sand. Unlike Mito, the ichabai was clearly afraid of him or at least felt threatened by him. But as soon as he told her she was a Biju, one of the strongest beings to ever walk the earth, she seemed to regain her confidence as quickly as sand would drink up spilled water in the summer sun. He laughed when he saw that she was only about as tall as he was, even though he was one of the tallest genin in the class that had just graduated. As she stood up, she lightly shook her head to get any sand out of her shoulder-length brown hair that might have gotten in it while she was on the ground. Not that he could have seen it. With only the moon for light and her hair being a light shade of brown, it wasn't surprising that the sand blended in perfectly. When she was done, she gave him a small smile. Her lips weren't painted, which led him to believe that Mito was the only one who had changed her appearance. Before he could come to any real conclusions, he had to meet a third Biju. Her eyes seemed to shine with a slight haughtiness that he would almost call pleasant, even though it didn't make any sense to him. Maybe the fact that she was Mito but not Mito was what confused him so much. Her attitude was similar to Mito's, but she didn't show as much pride because, unlike Mito, she seemed to understand that he was in charge here. It was a mix of comforting familiarity and strange wrongness, and he wasn't sure how to move forward for a moment. Did he treat her like he had treated Mito at first, counting on the fact that she already seemed to respect his authority to keep her in line? Or should he treat her as if she had already done what Mito did and keep her at a distance while making sure she is well cared for? Could it be possible to do neither and treat this Biju in a way that has nothing to do with how he acts around other Bijus? Considering how important Mito was to him just a few years ago, he wasn't sure how well he could pull off the last one. Even so, she needed a proper place to be. And while the desert was appropriate, it wasn't really good enough for a guest of Tsukiyomi. When she stood up, he asked, better. Her smile got just a little bit bigger. Yes, Naruto-sama. Thanks. He thought that the Biju liked it when other people took care of them. At least, that's what he's seen. He ignored the thank you. You are now in my care, ichabai. I want you to be happy and have all your needs met. She seemed happy about the idea based on the way her eyes lit up. But she stayed as noble as one could be after laying on the ground at his feet. Instead, she turned her head just a little and gave a small nod while keeping her smile. Of course, your highness. He only slightly narrowed his eyes when he heard the change from the polite but distant Naruto-sama to the much more personal my lord. It was as if she was recognizing his claim over her as more than just the fact that he was stronger. Not just letting him be in charge, but also welcoming it. So it appeared. After what happened with Mito, he wasn't so stupid as to blindly believe that. But if she was honest, he would be very, very happy with how easily she had accepted everything. Even though he didn't trust the gift, he wasn't going to look it in the mouth. Even if it was just a show, it gave him a chance to take care of everything he needed to in the seal before she showed who she really was. Then, if it came down to it, he would never have to talk to his new charge again. If that happened, it would be sad, but I wouldn't say it would be a big loss. Yes, he might not be able to use her power or have a friend tied to his soul by his father's seal, but he would have won because he had taken her away from Suna, who was planning to betray them. That was a fact that couldn't be changed, and that was enough to explain what he did. If that was all he got out of it, he couldn't really say anything bad about it. Again, he didn't have time to think about those things now because he had work to do. Now, said Naruto, let's start by making sure that you have a good place to stay. She looked at him twice and blinked, but she still didn't get it. Even the desert they were in now was better than her last prison, so she didn't think she needed anything else. It wasn't really right for a noblewoman, but she wasn't exactly a human either. As white marble spread out from under her lord's feet and changed the world around her, she began to realize that yes, it could get much better than it was. Even though she wasn't a noblewoman, she wouldn't say no to being treated like one. Before the first walls were built, the white stone went for a long way in every direction. and it fit right in with the gate Naruto had used to get into this desert. Small windows were left high up on the walls, close to the huge dome-shaped ceiling, and soft light came in through these windows. But that soft light wasn't coming from the moon they had left behind. Sunbeams of soft gold came through the archway and lit up the ground on either side. They also left a path of shadow that led from Naruto's world, that strange, flooded basement, to her new home, which was far away. Out of that shadow came a thick, dark blue rug with patterns of golden vines and white stitching in a triangle shape that could be mistaken for waves. The next thing to appear were tapestries, which were mostly just colored sheets on the walls at first, as if they were waiting to be finished. Next came delicate vases filled with bright, fragrant flowers that were held up by ornate golden stands. Even though she was a very old Biju, it was hard for her to understand how quickly and easily he had built this palace from the sands of the desert. He was doing it because he loved her. Even though they had spent some of their time in captivity in a tea kettle, the ichabai couldn't help but be amazed at their good luck now. "Come," he said firmly, and she was startled out of her thoughts when she felt his arm slip around hers. He started to walk her down the blue carpet slowly so she could take in her surroundings. Most of the time, it didn't seem like much was different. They were surrounded by tapestries, flowers, blue rugs, and white stone. Sometimes, large hallways with the same things would separate them. If there was anything else in this building, it was probably in the hallways or rooms she hadn't seen yet. Still, it was a beautiful palace, and she was glad just to be able to stay there. At what she thought was the end of the building based on how long they had been walking, a large arch rose up into the ceiling. It was much bigger than the others. Instead of being white, the palace was made of beaten gold from floor to ceiling and wall to wall. The work was mostly made up of large designs of flowers, animals, and stylized suns. Sometimes, the designs were broken up to show people in the background were those Biju. Yes, groups of humans gathered around the great-tailed animals to worship them. At first, she thought they might be groups of warriors coming to fight them, but a closer look showed her she was wrong. The ichabai was at the bottom, with all 9 tails spread out and resting on the floor. The number of worshippers seemed to match the number of tails, or maybe it was just how much space needed to be filled in the archway. But the size of each Biju seemed to be about the same, even though they had different numbers of tails. Hyubai, Hachibai, and Nenabi were all the same size as a fox. The beetle and the oxtopus were also the same size, but their bodies were a bit bigger because they didn't have tails. She kept looking up, over the Rokubai, with Naruto still standing next to her with his arm around hers. When she blinked, she was surprised to see a big tanuki with one tail looking back at her. At the exact center of the archway, it jumped from the Rokubai to her, the ichabai, and then went up with the Nibai, Sanbai, Yonbai, and Gobai as the arch widened into its second curve and there was more space on the connecting walls. Even though the whole thing seemed to be made just to create some kind of balance over the artwork. Even though it was a wall, it was still art. She couldn't help but be happy that her image was so clear in the palace she would be staying in, since she was in the middle and the biggest of the Biju shown to account for her single tail. Her look over is done for now. Does that elephant have 3 eyes? She looked at her host, who raised an eyebrow in silence. He answered her almost hesitant nod with a sharp, firm nod as he continued through the arch. She had hoped that he would ask her if she was done instead of asking her what she thought of the piece he had obviously done himself, since this was his seal domain. She didn't know it, but she stopped just inside the big room beyond. The blue rug ended a few feet in and was replaced by white marble that seemed to make up the whole palace. She hadn't seen a single seam that would indicate that the palace wasn't carved out of a single, huge piece of marble. But the floor was covered with squares of gold that were set with sapphires and rubies and had a white marble flower with silver veins running through it that looked like puddles. The squares weren't the only things on the floor, either. Long branches of elegantly curved gold connected them all, and sapphires were evenly spaced along the branches. It took her a minute of looking at the floor to realize that it all fit together to make a large geometric flower, like the ones in each square, that filled the whole room. She was sure that the sun made it shine the brightest and most beautiful. Speaking of which, she had seen the soft golden light of the afternoon sun on the way here, which had turned into the burning golden light of late evening. Even though this didn't make the flower shine, it seemed to melt the gold in the floor, and the whole room was filled with a warm glow that seemed to go against the cool breeze she could feel from the open wall in front of her. She couldn't really even call it a wall. The room was round, and a third of it was only held up by marble pillars that were intricately carved and covered in beaten gold and sapphires and rubies that were set into the floor. So little of the original pillar was left that the art that covered it looked like it was broken up by white bands. She was really interested in what was beyond those pillars, though. She was expecting to see sand, but instead she saw a huge garden filled with flowers of all colors and, she was pretty sure, smells. She had touched new sands for the first time in a long time. She didn't even know when she had last seen so many flowers. She had seen some of them as she walked through the palace halls, but that wasn't even close to the same as a real garden. With a pleading look at her host, who smiled and nodded in agreement, she hurried out into the gardens, ignoring the large throne in the middle of the open wall. Naruto walked behind her in a much calmer place. Since he had made this world, it was hard for him to be surprised by the palace. He stopped for a moment to run one hand over the arm of the throne, pleased by the cold stone it was made of. He briefly looked at the purple cushions that were arranged comfortably on the throne, but he was able to resist the urge to sit on them. The air in the throne room had started to get cooler, but as soon as he stepped down, he could feel a difference. This was because the floor of the throne room was a little higher than the garden it led to. Even though it was all in his seal and worked the way he wanted it to, the roof had been taken off the gardens. Who would try to break into a palace here anyway? This was his seal, and he was the only other person living in the palace. If someone somehow got through the seal, keeping them out of his palace was probably the last thing on his mind. As he walked over the soft floor to his wide-eyed guest, he smiled softly as he watched the shocked Biju try to take in all the sights and smells at once after being locked up for at least a decade in an unsuitable sealscape. He knew it had probably been longer for the poor thing, but he could only say for sure that it had been 10 years. After all, they had to put the seal on the host early, and Gara was probably just a year or two younger than him. He stopped a few steps away from her and waited patiently while she continued to enjoy his garden, or was it now hers? He thought it didn't matter that much because, in the end, it was for her pleasure. He looked at the red wood lattice that went around the wall in a circle and had vines growing all over it. He also looked at the small box of latticework in the middle, right next to the back of the throne. It, too, was covered in plants, but there were far fewer of them. It had a door made of the same red wood. It seemed less important than it really was. He finally broke the silence on his own. He said softly, "Tell me, ichabai, who is Gara to you?" The Biju stopped. He had just taken a delicate lily from among its siblings with one hand. She brought it to her nose and smelled it for a moment while she thought about what to say. Then, with a soft sigh, she started to talk. "He is my vessel, of course, but maybe he is more. Sometimes he is my servant," she admitted. "And others, a son of mine. An unwilling prison, a life I've shaped from the start into the monster he is becoming. That made people raise an eyebrow. Who are you? I was sure he was a monster until he met you. You were more than him, more than me, more than the two of us together. The monster I had made would have just attacked, but you made him stop, think, and plan. There was still intelligence to tame the bloodlust." She hesitated to say the next part because she didn't want to insult her new host, her new lord. She couldn't bring herself to think of Gara as her previous lord or Naruto as anything but a lord. I wonder, though, if he has changed his mind or just turned into a different kind of monster because of this. Naruto didn't get angry when it was said that he was turning Gara into some kind of monster. Instead, he just nodded to show that he understood. "That's a good question," he said, but he didn't say anything else about how human her last host was. He did, however, talk about something else that was related. "Would you like to meet up with him?" Her eyes, which had been on the flower she was holding, suddenly shot up to his. She could talk to Gara and knew some things about the outside world because of his sand and whatever his birth mother did to it. But she had never met the boy in person. But did she want to do it? She thought about why she shouldn't meet with the boy who had called her mother for most of his life. At first, she tried to come up with reasons not to. She couldn't think of a good reason not to, other than the chance that he might reject her, which seemed like such a small thing now that she lived in the desert palace of her new lord. Even if it was a monster, she really wanted to see what she had made. In fact, even more so if it was a monster. She couldn't deny that it made her feel proud that he had shed blood in her name. She might have gone a little crazy because of a horrible seal and abysmal sealscape. But the desert was violent by nature, and so was she. I like that idea, Naruto-sama. She may have been queen of the desert before, but everyone in the desert knew that even the sands moved when the wind told them to. And as clear as the sand and the wind, she knew and accepted who the Lord was here. "Then shall we go say hello?" He said it like a question, but it was clear that he expected her to take his arm, so she did so without saying anything. Even though he wasn't in a hurry, his steps were not as slow as they used to be. They now had more purpose than a relaxing tour of her new prison, if it could be called that. Some people had said before that a gilded cage was still a cage, but they didn't realize that a cage was sometimes the best choice. For a Biju like her, who would just be attacked and put back in a worse cage, a gilded cage was definitely the best they could hope for. She was definitely better than people. but that didn't mean they couldn't hurt her, just like even the smallest pests could hurt a person. And while the Kyuubi or some of her other siblings might say they should just kill anyone who tried to attack them, she knew that would only make more humans try. And if all humans were killed, she would go back to being a lesser Biju, which is the step between animals and the mighty Biju. She didn't like the idea at all, because she liked being smarter than other living things. Well, people who were alive but weren't summons. She would be the first to admit that she didn't know what those animals were or where they were supposed to be in the world, if they were supposed to have a place. He took her to the wooden door with green vines around it. He stopped for a moment, as if to think about something, and then went for the handle. It wasn't open. He sneered at the handle and gave it a sharp twist, but it turned anyway. The ichabai looked at the cracks in the small building's wooden latticework with confusion. It almost looked like Naruto pushing his way through the door had caused the cracks. But that didn't make sense because the door wasn't broken in any way. Before her eyes, the damage was fixed, leaving scars in the wood where it had been broken. How strange. When the door opened, she stopped looking at the building and looked into the darkness outside. He walked in with his arms still around hers. He didn't wait for her to be ready. In the blink of an eye, the palace was gone. As the night turned into moonlight, the marble they were standing on turned into a dull, flat roof. She looked out at Sunagakure no Sato, which she had only seen twice before, and couldn't believe what she saw. She thought he hadn't been there even once. Even though the palace was beautiful, this shouldn't be possible. He couldn't have made the house of her previous host so quickly without ever having been there. Unless he hadn't done it. The thought was strange and almost didn't make sense, but she couldn't get rid of it. He was in charge of her sealscape, but were they still there? She turned to look at him, but when she did, she saw that he was just looking around. It only proved what she had already thought, that they were no longer in his territory. She thought that was even stranger. He was her lord and held her seal, but was that true here in the middle of Suna? Did she still have to be loyal to him after she stopped being his guest? Almost as if he knew what she was thinking, he turned to her with purple eyes that looked deep into her soul. If Biju had anything like that. At that moment, the answer to her question was most clear. Yes, he is my lord, yes. She was surprised by how much better she felt now that she knew. But it didn't tell her where or what they were doing. You wanted to see him, didn't you? His voice pulled her out of her thoughts and seemed to answer the questions she hadn't said out loud. With a careless wave of his hand, he said, "Go on, then. Call out for him." Gara was the name she was supposed to use. But what good would that do? Naruto held her seal. He had taken it from Gara to keep her safe from the world and, more importantly, from himself. Now that she was his, he would protect her, but did she still have any right to Gara? She did, though. She was his mother and his goddess, and she knew he would do anything she asked. She might belong to Naruto, but Gara was hers, now that she was ready to try. But still not sure what would happen. Her first attempt was not very strong. Gara. It was more of a question than an order, and it was sad. A quick, hesitant look over at Naruto, whose arms were still around hers, made her cringe in deep shame. From the look on his face, it looked like he thought it was sad, too. He almost seemed disappointed, which made Ichabai feel awful. She was the great Biju of the desert. Her name was Ichabai. She was a goddess, and the people who lived in the sand should have worshipped her. But she couldn't bring herself to call for her son, who was her best worker. She couldn't trust her lord and do what he wanted, the way Gara did. The thing that bothered her the most was her last thought. She drew herself up to her full height and straightened her back with pride. She stole another look over to her lord and saw that he was watching her with a silent nod of approval, which gave her a warm sense of confidence and a steely resolve. He was the Kyuubi's guardian, and she could still taste her brother or sister on him, but he never mentioned the other Biju, even though the seal should have let them all meet. The fact that she wasn't there seemed to show that she was no longer with him, which made Ichabai feel angry and hurt. And her anger made her even more determined. She wouldn't let her lord down like the Kyuubi, who clearly had. And if she ever saw the Kyuubi again, with or without 9 tails, she would make sure they knew their place at their lord's feet. With one last breath, his new servant did what he wanted. Gara. It was probably a good thing that Temari had already fallen asleep in Tsukiyomi's arms, because her panic when her youngest brother fell asleep for the first time she could remember would have made everyone in Konohagakure think the invasion had started early. Naruto wouldn't have liked it. Gara was used to sitting on his bed and doing nothing. He had done this almost every night of his life, because he didn't do anything else besides kill people. And the people of Sunagakure quickly learned not to go out at night. But this time was different. Before, all he did was wait until morning. Now, though, he had something to look forward to. Gara couldn't wait for Naruto-sensei to set up the seal so that his mother could talk to him again. He had never really been alone, because even when the ichabai wasn't talking to him, the young shinobi could feel its presence. His whole life had been filled with mindless laughter, rants, raves, mutterings, and even the occasional song. Even though he was in a room with 2 other people, he had never felt so alone. It didn't work for him, so he waited anxiously for Naruto to finish his job, which was strange in and of itself. He had never felt worry before. He had been excited before, giddy with the thought of bloodshed. But if you could solve every problem you ever had, why would you ever be worried? Now, the problem was that he couldn't solve it, and the silence was starting to bother him more than his mother's words ever had. Even Gara knew that his mother had problems that he couldn't help her with and that she couldn't solve with her power, which he had been given to show that he existed. But she was still his mother, and he loved her more than anyone else in his own way. It was one of the reasons he was so willing to let Naruto, who was even stronger than he was, take care of her. She would feel safest with him, and he might be able to give her something that her previous host couldn't. Gara really hoped he could. His mother's ramblings had become less clear over the years, which he had only noticed in the past few months. From what Naruto-sama said earlier, though, it sounds like his seal wasn't very good. Maybe the seal was hurting mother. From what he knew, Naruto-sama's work to change the seal completely should have helped her a lot in that case. Gara was very happy to think about this. Even though it was nice to feel good, time didn't go by any faster, which was really too bad, because Gara had never been patient and had never wanted something as much as he did now. He just needed to hear her voice, even just one word, and he would be happy. So, when he heard that word, which was his own name, he didn't wait to reach out for her comforting presence. As he answered her call, he felt a sense of familiarity wash over him. He had a vague idea that his body seemed to fall asleep on the bed while he was taken far away to a world he had never seen before. A world that had always been around him but was always out of reach. Up to now, Naruto almost laughed out loud when he saw the look of surprise on the ikabai's face when Gara came when he called for him. That quickly changed to a single eyebrow raised, half in amusement and half in amazement, when she managed to train her face so quickly that it gave off an air of absolute authority. Not that she was, but there wasn't much reason for Gara to know that right now, so Naruto just stayed by her side with his arms still around her. He thought that this fact might be enough to stop any plans Gara might have had to kill him. If there was one person Gara would answer to in the whole world, it would be her. And the way their arms were linked made it look like any move against Gara would make his mother very upset. If nothing else, it should make him more open to Naruto's ideas or orders, even if it doesn't stop the former Jinchuriki from trying to kill him again if he thinks it's necessary. It didn't take long for the new person to figure out where they were, and Gara took everything pretty well, even though he was a little surprised to see his village around him. That is, until his eyes fell on the ichabai. Mother. Naruto realized that this was probably the first time Gara had seen either of his mothers in real life. The young man didn't know what to do. He was on the verge of dropping to his knees where he stood or running to see if what he was seeing was real. The ichabai made that choice for him, and Naruto realized he needed to find out the name of Gara's mother. Ichabai wasn't good enough, and Shukaku wasn't his thing. She told Gara firmly, "Come to me," but her voice was warm and her eyes were smiling. She was glad to finally meet him in person, and even though the seal was still messing with her mind, she had always liked him. He had been very good at making sure she got blood when she asked for it, and he had the best habit of making sure she got it even when she didn't. Someone like her couldn't help but be grateful for how much he cared. The fact that she was no longer bound by the old seal also helped a lot. Gara ran over to her right away, but he seemed to lose his strength as he fell to his knees at her feet. She gave him a soft smile and put one hand on his red hair, gently ruffling it like she would a pet, which, as far as the Biju was concerned, wasn't too far off, or so Naruto thought. He hesitantly reached up and took her delicate hand in both of his. He rubbed his thumb over her skin as if he were making sure she wasn't a mirage, or a dream that was about to end. Kasama. The relief in his voice was clear, but his eyes looked like they were about to cry with happiness. Not only could he hear his voice again, but he could also touch, feel, and look at his mother's face. Even though he said he only loved himself, she was the most important person to him. She had been a part of him for a long time, but seeing her go like this only proved that he had never been alone, and would never really be alone. He had never been so happy in all his life. As his eyes kept drinking in the shape of his mother, he saw an arm that didn't belong to her. He was curious, so he followed the tattooed arm until he reached a body with deep red hair, and the same height as his mother. Purple's eyes, which he knew could see right through him, looked down from where she was standing next to his mother, and he knew right away who it was. Gara was glad that Naruto-sama kept his promise and brought his mother back more than ever before. But there was a lot more here. Mother was scared of him when they first met, and with good reason. But now, with his arm wrapped around hers, she stood next to him comfortably, as relaxed as her formal posture would allow. As he looked up at the man he had let himself hate and fear since the first time they met, the man he owed this moment to and who had helped him get to where he is now, he realized that Naruto-sama had never done anything to him or his mother, no matter how scared he had been of him. In fact, everything he had done was meant to keep his mother, and by extension, Gara, safe. He had even taken her into a seal on himself and become her new host to make sure she was taken care of. Gara could only come to one conclusion. The answer is to Sama. Naruto might have liked the pretty blush on Ikabai's cheeks if he hadn't been so completely taken by surprise. After a minute of silence, he said, well, trying not to notice how the Ichabai laughed at his surprise. I guess we'll have to talk about this soon. Until then, I think you and your mom should spend some time getting to know each other again, son. He wasn't even going to try to act like what he was saying wasn't weird as hell. He thought, though, that his time with the wolves had prepared him in some small way for something like this. As he had just seen, though, being slightly ready was very different from being ready for a former Jinchuriki and current foreign shinobi of a village planning to betray yours to look at you like a father. Gara and the Ichabai sat down on a nearby bench to talk to each other for the first time in over a decade. Naruto thought quietly to himself. He shook his head and said, a Biju, her keeper, and their murderous son. What a great family we'll make. He must not have been as quiet as he thought, because the Ichabai heard him and almost beamed with happiness at what he said. Even though he would never say it, her smile made him more nervous than the idea of Gara being his son. Kankuro woke up much later than he usually did. The sun was shining brightly through the window of the hotel, filling the main room with its cursedly happy light. He really didn't like anything that woke him up, and sunlight was one of the worst offenders. However, he was more confused than anything else about how long he had slept. Gara's threats to kill him for being lazy or his sister's Warfen greeting his skull with all the energy of the morning sun would usually wake him up. But today they seemed to be hiding from the light inside the bedroom. He was still a little upset that he didn't get a bed and had to sleep on the couch instead. Not because the couch was so uncomfortable that it was worse than his bed, but because the beds were bigger and had more room to move around, which would have been great. And if the couch was this nice, think about how nice the beds would be. He knew why his older sister got one because she was the oldest, and he wasn't going to stop Gara from taking the other one because he wasn't going to kill himself. But he couldn't understand why his younger brother needed one. If he was just going to sit on it all night and look out the window at the night sky, he could have done the same thing from the couch, right? Then, he wouldn't be able to keep his siblings from sleeping in a separate room, even if he woke up in the middle of the night. Kankuro often thought Gara only saw them as teammates he needed to reach stronger opponents to beat. Even if he was right, he wasn't so stupid to think Gara would want to hear it in the first place, especially since Kankuro was a puppeteer. They tried very hard to stay away from risk, thank you. So, they went into hiding and had puppets do the work. Far more like a shinobi than most people these days. As a puppeteer, you didn't get very far if you weren't careful. Still, the fact that they weren't up was strange, especially since Gara was always awake because of his mother. Kankuro couldn't think of any reason why Gara would stay in bed for so long. Even though he said he was a careful puppeteer, he was probably far too curious for his own good. He crept over to the bedroom door, glad he didn't have to worry about Baki, who was staying in a smaller hotel by himself. He could have stayed with them, which would have given the Suna group an extra room like the one the siblings were using as their home. But the man was smart enough to stay away from the Jinchuriki while the moon was getting bigger. Unlike Gara's siblings, the sensei wasn't needed for the exams and could be easily replaced if the redhead lost control. Or, rather, just not do anything to keep it up. It seemed like the only reason Gara didn't hurt his siblings was because he wanted to stay in the exam. Usually, Kankuro was sure that the death threats were real and that Gara would be able to carry them out at any time. Kankuro couldn't help but think that he was glad Baki wasn't there, because if he tried to sneak into the room where he knew Gara was awake and sitting on his bed, Baki would call him an idiot. He stopped for a moment to think about what he had just realized. Then his sister mumbled something sleepy and a light snore filled the room at the same time. So, either there was someone else in that room who shouldn't have been there, or Gara was fast asleep. Even though the second choice would be terrible, Kankuro had to know about it. And if that meant he could wake Gara up before he lost control of his body, well, Konoha and Temari both owed him a lot of money. He didn't have a good chance of getting that favor from either of them, so he sneaked into the room again and wondered, aside from his curiosity, what was driving him to do it. When the door made a soft creaking sound, Kankuro was startled to realize that he had already reached the door, which was only half open to the room beyond. Well, it's too late to change your mind now. Gara would have definitely heard that. It was a good sign that Kankuro was still breathing and not a mangled body buried in the sand. After a few quick, quiet steps, he was in the main room. He almost died from a heart attack. Surprisingly, it wasn't because Gara was sleeping peacefully in his bed, but because there was someone in Temeri's bed. Someone's name. A man with his arms around a woman. A man whose arms were around her and whose arms were around him. His older sister, Temeri, seemed to be sharing her bed with this male person, which, to be honest, was about as likely as Gara becoming a pacifist. For God's sake, she was enjoying a gentle embrace with the guy. Temeri was not a gentle girl, as her Warfan's constant hits to his head showed. Kankuro quickly pinched himself to make sure he wasn't dreaming. When he realized he wasn't, he forgot for a moment that Gara was also in the room, sleeping happily for the first time in his life. What the fucks? This might not be the smartest thing to do. Temeri groaned as he came back to the world of the living. Even though it was probably the best sleep she could remember, her stupid brother had to wake her up. Why did he choose today, of all the days, to get up before them? She would have thought that he would take every chance to sleep in. The light from the still open window told her it was well after the time she usually went to sleep. But she didn't care about that and instead turned to her sleeping partner. As she laid on his chest, two of his arms wrapped around her lower back and pressed down firmly. Slow breathing and a steady heartbeat told her that her brother's shout hadn't woken him up. This made her want to forget about it and go back to sleep. She started following the different marks on his pectorals out of boredom. She remembered the seal on his left side, over his heart. The seal he used to get Gara to back down was still on his right arm and pectoral, but she thought the marks on his left arm and shoulder were new. She hadn't seen him since that day, though. She probably should have been upset to find him in her bed, but she was too comfortable to be upset about anything more than the fact that her sleep with her new friend had been interrupted. Also, Gara seemed to like it, which meant either doing what he wanted or staying away from upsetting someone that her youngest brother wouldn't dare go against. No matter what, it was best for her not to fight with either of the redheads, and she was having a good time anyway. Kankuro was the only one who didn't seem to win, but no one really cared about him anyway. He chose that moment to speak up again, almost as if he knew that the thought of him had been so easy to dismiss. Well, she didn't so much speak as shout. Even though Temeri didn't know it, Gara was still trying to sleep. Who the fucks is in your bed, Temeri? She, as if it had anything to do with him. She didn't pay attention to him. Instead, she put her cheek on the pale chest and closed her eyes, letting herself relax to the sound of the heart beating below her. The sudden wave of killing intent, on the other hand, woke her up from her idle thoughts and made it clear that whatever Gara had done to stay quiet during the first shout, he was not happy with the second. Kankuro. It was long, dangerous, and threatened a lot of pain, but it also sounded sleepy. When she moved her left shoulder away from her sleeping bedmate and turned over so she was next to him and leaning against his warm body, she was surprised and happy to find that he immediately wrapped his arms around her and put two warm hands just above her hips, under her shirt. The pleasant surprise seemed to cancel out the bad surprise of seeing her youngest sibling get up from his pillow and look sleepily at her middle sibling from inside a cocoon of blankets. She wasn't sure if the way the raccoon was literally rubbing sand out of his sleepy eyes was cute or horrifying, but the fact that she felt safe in the arms of someone Gara wouldn't dare go up against made her lean toward cute. She was almost tempted to ask him to sleep with her and then so she could use him as a pillow. The fact that she would even think about it showed how much she liked where she was and how safe she felt. And it wasn't like Gara didn't look like he needed a few more days of rest or that she hadn't felt the same way when they were all younger. After all, he was her youngest brother, and she had always wanted to look after him. This could be her last chance. When she gently elbowed the young man behind her, he seemed to understand her silent request. If he was still asleep after that outburst and Gara making her displeasure known, he backed up to the wall while dragging her, which seemed to prove that he had been woken up but didn't want to get up, which Gara also found quite pleasing. Now that there was more room in her bed, even though it was only meant for one person, she invited a third person to join her. "Come here, Gara," she said, even though she'd never done anything like that before. She opened her arms to show her brothers where she was talking about. Kankuro's jaw dropped in complete shock, but Gara didn't even wait a second before he got out of bed, still wrapped in his blanket cocoon, and shuffled over to his sister's bed. He looked at the people sleeping in it for a moment before tilting his head in confusion. Ni-chan, Temari had been waiting years to hear that from him and was sure that this was a good idea. He stopped for a moment, looking sleepy and confused, which she thought was very cute. He then looked at her friend and then back at her. Other Kasim. She blinked in surprise, but the groan from behind her told her that the other person in the bed knew exactly what her brother meant. She didn't know how to answer him verbally, so she just opened her arms wider. Gara didn't waste any time getting into bed with them. It looked like her bedmate was at the end of a long chain, and the curtains were quickly drawn, making the room dark and cozy, which made it even harder to fall asleep. Kankuro, on the other hand, still had no idea what was going on. But what do I mean? Gara's threatening growl, Kankuro, stopped him. One of his teal eyes glared at him from behind the blankets and in his sister's arms. Stop talking or I will kill you. As the middle sibling quickly left the room and Mizuno Kuni, a fellow redhead, was confusedly happy, and now felt sorry for a man he had never met. When Baki went to see his students, Kankuro was at the door with a box of pastries. This was a little strange, but not too strange for the group Baki led. With a murderous Jinchuriki, a moody wind mistress, and a kabuki, they often found themselves in strange situations, both on missions and in Sunagakuyor. It was a little late for breakfast, since it was almost noon, and Temari would have been up for hours already, so it was likely that Kankuro had upset her. It wasn't the first time the middle child had tried to make her forget about his misdeeds by giving her sweets. Even though Temari always seemed to enjoy them, they never made her feel better about him. He followed the boy into the hotel room because he was a little bit curious about what had happened this time. He was sure that Temari would be angry, with her fists on her hips and Worfen close by, and Gara would be standing on the windowsill and not doing anything. Kankuro instead went to the small kitchenette and put the box of pastries on the small table where 3 other people were sitting. Temari looked very happy from where she was sitting, with an empty cup of coffee in front of her and her Worfen oddly absent. Gara was sitting right next to her, which was a big surprise. And not just next to her, he was tucked into her side and seemed very comfortable. Even though he was close, Temari didn't seem scared at all, which was strange. But the third person at the table was even more strange. Not only were they sitting right next to Gara, but they were also pressed up against the boy's side. The young man who was shirtless and sipping coffee was also there. Gara should have told him not to be so calm, and he never thought Temari, who was clearly becoming a young woman, would let a shirtless stranger be near her. She had never been interested in boys, and the young man couldn't be a clueless civilian who didn't know how dangerous Gara was because he had seals on both arms and the top of his body. It only took Baki another second to figure out something that, now that it was clear, made him feel even worse. Temari and the redhead without a shirt weren't sitting close to Gara because they were trying to get close to him. Instead, it looked like Gara had squeezed himself between the 2 people who were already sitting close together. Gara had wanted to be between the 2 of them, and even though he was probably squished, he seemed happy with where he was. Baki didn't know what to think about the situation, especially when Kankuro quickly grabbed plates from nearby cabinets and put them in front of each person at the table. Baki knew something was very, very wrong when Kankuro, who was done with his job, ran into the bedroom he had been kicked out of on their first day here in order to hide. The Suna Jounin was even more scared when the stranger invited him to sit with a calm tone, as if this was their hotel room. Even though Temari and Gara didn't seem to mind at all that the young man was in charge. He sat down at his desk and noticed that there was more paperwork than when he had left. He tried to ignore the fact that all the wolves in the apartment had moved into positions around his office. They must not have liked being told to stay here when he left last night to meet Gara. He probably didn't help when he hadn't come home. He really did care about them, but this was a little too much. Still, he would let them stay if it helped them calm down. The female wolf, who had chosen to sit right behind him for reasons he didn't understand, began to rub his shoulders as he started to fill out the paperwork. Yes, they could stay for a little while. 3 hours after he began his paperwork, there were only 3 guards left. The only other man in the room was leaning against the wall in the corner, where he could see both the door and his lord. He seemed to be having a good time as his 2 female packmates took turns rubbing Naruto's shoulders and playing with his hair. Naruto was done with his work a half hour ago, but he didn't want to stop the other 2 from having fun. He knew he needed a hobby, but he might not have been the only one. He could probably set up a sort of recreation room without too much trouble, but he might also want to make a resort for his wolves. If that wasn't possible, he could make a deal with an existing resort so that his kids could use the facilities and take some time to relax. Then it was just a matter of getting them to go to the resort instead of just hanging out with him, which they probably would have preferred. He laughed briefly at the idea that he would have to go on vacation himself to get them to the resort, but then he realized that they would be even more careful if they saw him trying to relax. He thought to himself, they're too much like their dad for their own good. When his office door opened and his wolves tensed up, he stopped what he was doing. When the visitor turned out to be Orochimaru herself, they felt a little better. Her always present smirk turned into a smile when she saw her godson. "Ah, Naruto-kun, you're back." He gave a distracted hum in response. The two wolves behind him went back to gently kneading his shoulders, and Orochimaru's smile turned back into an amused smirk. "Having fun, are we?" she asked with a purr as she watched her crimson prince get treated well. She was angry for a short time, but she was able to get rid of it quickly. This is how he should have lived, and this is what he got. Even though she knew that he wouldn't be the Naruto he is now without what he went through, she was still mad that it had to happen. There was another hum, followed this time by words. "Did you need something, godmother?" "I don't need a reason to come see you, Naruto-kun," she said as she sat down at the edge of his desk. He hummed again, his eyes only half open by choice. "So there wasn't something you needed." She laughed, but it was almost a giggle in this new body. She didn't think she'd be able to get her scary laugh back until she got a vessel with a deeper voice or messed with the vocal cords of the one she was in at the time. Naruto seemed to like her just the way she was, so they could wait for a while. "Well, maybe it's not necessary." She trailed off, drawing shapes on his desk with one finger as she looked down and away from him. He laughed at her act. "So then, what did you want?" She laughed again, which was still hard for him to understand as an S-rank rogue ninja. "Oh, Naruto-kun, you know me, I want lots of things." His eyes were closed, so he didn't see the brief flashes of red on her cheeks. Even if he could have seen it, she had her head turned away from him. The man who called himself Tsukiyomi was the only one who broke the silence with a happy groan now and then. With every groan, the red on the Sanin's cheeks got a little bit brighter. "So," Tsukiyomi said, breaking the silence. He had no idea that his wolves were looking at him and his godmother, who was blushing, with amused looks as they worked together in silence to get the biggest response they could from her using only their lord's groans. "Why did you come to see me today? The final exam is in a week, and I know you're moving with your small group around that time. And, don't you think the invasion and chaos among the Hyuga would be the perfect time to sneak one out?" Naruto was quiet for a moment, just enjoying the way the fingers danced over his shoulders, before he opened his eyes and looked into Orochimaru's hopeful eyes. "Oh, so you want a Hyuga?" She kept tracing the desk with her finger. "Only if it's not too hard, Naruto-kun," she said with a bit of a breathy tone. "That would mean a lot to me." He thought for a while, then went quiet again before asking, "What kind of Hyuga would you need?" She said, trying not to sound too happy that he was actually considering what she had asked for. "Well, the best vessel would be a 20-year-old Hyuga woman from a main family, but there aren't any Hyuga who meet those requirements, and I'm not sure how the Byakugan and Sharingan would mix if I took over a body with both." He raised his eyebrow, which was a silent sign to go on. "A male Hyuga of the main family would probably be best, as with just one of them I could impregnate several of my kunoichi. But I could use a branch member so long as no one activated the caged bird seal before I can retrieve the necessary samples from them. With the coop you have your hands in, the caged bird seal will likely never be activated again, but I can't dismiss the possibility that the Hyuga will fail you, which would lead to all the seals being activated." Naruto thought about it for a minute and realized that if the seal was broken, it would ruin his plans and that the Byakugan was too important to throw away if something went wrong. He finally said, "I'll see what I can do, but have one of your agents ready to take samples from a branch Hyuga before the invasion. If things go wrong, Hinata might be able to send you one to make sure the clan doesn't die out." Naruto didn't know how the main family kept branch members from sleeping with outsiders and spreading unsealed Byakugan users, or why Kumagakure never paid a Konoha prostitute 1,000,000 yen to get pregnant by a branch member and make their way back to Kumo. But he would take advantage of the fact that the seal was activated by death to clear all genetic material, and wouldn't be able to stop someone from taking a sample and artificially NC. What a terrible mistake they made. On the other hand, he knew how the seal worked because he had used his own to make Hinata's seal useless. No one else, as far as he knew, had a similar advantage that gave them insight into the situation. The seal keeper was really very useful, and he was excited to use some of its features in his plans for the future. "Oh, Naruto-kun, you're the best. You only say that because I do nice things for you." She let out another laugh. "A girl does like nice things, Naruto-kun, you should always remember that," she said. In response, she got a grunt that didn't say much. "Was there anything else, godmother?" asked the Sannin, crossing her arms under her bust in a pout. "Moo, doesn't Orochimaru-chan sound so much better than godmother?" His blank look turned into a sigh as he closed his eyes and tried to remember that he was talking to an S-ranked shinobi, or kunoichi these days, who was known for experimenting on people and being treacherous. Was it because they were around him? Or did they just gloss over their personalities that made the legendary shinobi seem so much better than the rest? He reluctantly agreed that it might have something to do with him. Even though they were slowly getting known, the wolves were not legendary shinobi, and they also acted like kids around him. He didn't know if they were ignoring their own problems because he was older or because they were trying to get him to relax. He's probably going to get a little bit of both. Then, Orochimaru-chan, was there anything else? Oh, Naruto-kun, that's much better. I love how you say my name. She runs her own secret village, which is allied with the country I control. She could break you in half in an instant, but she would rather give you the whole world. Well, thinking about these things made it a lot easier for him to be nice to the woman. If she wanted to act like this around him, he didn't have much power to stop her. He could probably tell her to stop, but he had a feeling that would only make her pout more, which, while cute, made him feel more powerless than he liked. She was always a snake in the grass, even when she was acting like a child and being nice. He asked again, anything else? He didn't say her name because he didn't want her to be too distracted. He would have to think about how it made her feel, though. To be safe, she gave a tiny pout, which showed that she knew what he had just done, but she didn't say much about it. It was cute, and that was a little scary. He thought that the whole situation would still seem strange for a while. Maybe if she changed bodies a few more times, he would get used to it, but for now he did his best to deal with everything about her. He thought it was the best plan he could come up with. With a disappointed sigh instead of a pout, she said, no, that was all Naruto-kun. She paused for a moment to think before continuing. She had realized something by the slight surprise and embarrassment in her voice. She seemed almost hopeful that there was something she could do for him or give him. It could have been because she wanted to help him or didn't want to feel like she was asking for something without giving anything in return. Based on how he talked to her, he thought it was the second, but that she would say it was the first if someone other than him asked. Well, if she was happy enough that she didn't kill the person who dared to ask her a question. He was pretty sure that he was the only one who could get away with that. But he wasn't ready to try it out yet, even though she seemed friendly and caring. And even though she seemed to be completely devoted to him, he hadn't known her long enough to know how her mind works. He did have a good idea, though, because it looked a lot like his own. That thought actually made him feel a little uneasy, which made it easier for him to get used to the way she pouted. Sad to say, that made the idea that they sometimes thought so alike even worse. It was a cycle of positive feedback that kept getting worse, and the only thing it did was make him feel better with her cute pout. Even that was a scary thought, and he needed to stop thinking about it before he went too far down that particular pouty rabbit hole. He hummed slowly to let her know he was still thinking and to get his mind off of what he had been thinking. He finally realized that if there was something he needed, it wasn't coming to mind. Well, it wasn't real anyway. Unless you can change time so I can care for my pack and my flock and keep up with my training. I don't think there's anything specific I need right now, he finally said. Orochimaru gave a grin. Even though she didn't have a solution right away, she now knew he had a problem and could start looking for ways to fix it. She promised, I'll see what I can come up with. You know that if I have enough time, I can do anything. He gave a simple snort in response, and then he gave himself back to the care of the wolves behind him. When it came to training, he had to find out if Yugao was free for some sparring. He needed to get out and do something. Hell, he just needed to. He worried about his wolves and his little shepherdess's flock so much these days that he rarely went out. And when he did, like last night, things rarely went as planned. When he went to talk to Gara last night, the last thing on his mind was becoming the dominant partner in a relationship with a Biju, becoming a father figure to a Jinchuriki who had been neglected, starting to fix the relationship between that Jinchuriki and his older sister, and sharing a bed with that older sister. He thought to himself that plans seemed to go wrong all around him, even his own. Even though most of his plans worked out, he didn't have to say especially his own, but he would admit that there were a few surprises in his own plans. And not just surprises, but things that came out of nowhere. Surprises were supposed to happen when something went wrong or when something went well, not when murderous Jinchuriki decided you were their new dad. He didn't even know how to put that into a category. He didn't have to get used to being a pseudo-father right away, which was good. The wolves made sure that he got a lot of practice on a regular basis. Speaking of which, he really needed to spend more time with them, which was much more important than going back to training. But it looks like he had already started with these three, which was good. The girls liked playing with his hair, and the wolf in the corner seemed to find both that and the way he talked to his godmother very funny. Even though he didn't talk to them directly, it was clear that they were happy to be around him when he was so calm and, in the case of the girl, to have even a small amount of physical contact with him. If it hadn't been so important to him, he might have found it funny that his attempts to care for the wolves made him ignore them. He knew that they wouldn't feel that way because they were happy to know that they were helping him. Any extra time he spent with them was just a bonus, and he was sure a great honor. He was pretty sure that these three would be very proud to tell their story tonight. Even better, he thought that the wolves who heard about this simple interaction would be quite jealous, which, of course, showed how much more time he needed to spend with his wolves. It looks like he won't be training after all. As much as he wanted to become a shinobi, he knew he could become one of Hinata's wolves instead. They would always come first in his heart, and he didn't think he was a good enough leader to follow his own dreams when so many people depended on him. His duty to them would always come before his own wants, even if they would be happy to suffer for him to get what he wanted. He cared too much about them for that to happen. Amused, he thought back to what he had said before and had to agree with himself. They were really too much like him for their own good. Or maybe it was because two things, the wolves and himself, were trying to look out for each other even if it hurt them. Both of them were also pretty damn stubborn. His godmother's voice stopped him from thinking and made one of his eyes pop open. She said, "Well," he laughed again when she said, "I'm leaving. I'll try not to make too much trouble." He was about to tell her to stay away from all of them. "Please do, Orochimaru-chan," she said with a bright smile that showed how much she liked it when he called her that. And her cheeks were a little bit red. As she leaned in to give him a quick kiss on the cheek, that red got even brighter. She promised, "For you, Naruto-kun. You're just too pretty to say no to." As she left his office and desk, the two wolves behind him agreed in silence. Experience told him he couldn't be done with paperwork, even though it looked like he had gotten it all done for the day. So, he sent one of the wolves to Mai to see if she had any paperwork she hadn't finished. He had known Mai for years, while Orochimaru had only known her for a few months. The chances that she wouldn't give him work because she thought he was too tired were far too high. Luckily, it looked like she was taking a break, tea with Sum, of course, so the wolf he sent ran into no trouble. He was sure that she would be angry with him when she got back, if she even noticed. Who was he trying to fool? She would know. He would try, though, to finish some of the work he was given and put it in her finished pile before she got back from her date with Sum. Maybe she would miss that, and her bigger pile of finished work would just show that her break was well earned, which it was. That girl worked too hard for him, and he should have made sure she took more time off. Maybe a trip to a hot springs resort. She would never agree to that. She wouldn't like the idea of leaving work for even a day, so she'd have to be persuaded to take any kind of vacation. Maybe he could give Tsum a trip to a resort for two with all costs paid and tell her how hard Mai had been working. Most likely, that would work, even though she was his most loyal wolf, or maybe because of it, she was the most likely to disobey him, especially if she thought that what he asked would hurt him in some way, which is what she would have thought in this case. On the other hand, Tsum seemed to be a pretty good weakness to use against her in this kind of situation. He didn't know if it was because they were dating, because Mai was too attracted to her to say no, or because Mai liked having another woman in charge with whom she could talk and look up to. Could it be a mix of all three? He had never asked what kind of relationship they had, whether they were just friends or more than that. After all the work he made her do, it wasn't his business how she calmed down. He tried not to think about what the two women might be up to with each other. Instead, he focused on his new stack of papers and began working on them with care. Not long after he started, though, a kunoichi of Otagakure stopped him again. This one, on the other hand, was much younger and not nearly as strong. "Ah, Naruto-sama," she said after a hesitant knock. She didn't want to get in the way of anything too important. He was important to her mistress, Orochimaru, and both she and Dasu realized that he was the real power behind Nami no Kuni. Someone like that probably had better things to do than talk to her, and they probably wouldn't care much about her personal problems, especially if they were with a genin teammate. It shouldn't have been his business at all, and she thought for a moment about changing her plans. Maybe this whole plan wasn't well thought out. But Dasu could only keep Zaku busy for a little while before their third teammate might do something stupid. If they were lucky, it would be something that made the person they wanted to help mad. Not a good combination for them. Taking a deep breath to calm herself down, she did her best to keep her eyes on his lips, avoiding his eyes to show that she was submissive, but also paying full attention to him. As he looked up from his papers to see who was there, he asked, with a questioning hum. He made a small worry mark on his lips. He had been putting off work, training, and his wolves, and now he was putting off his guests. He moved the need to reorganize the wolves so that they could be run better with less of his help close to the top of his list of priorities. He really needs the extra time. With a flick of the wrist, he signed the current paper and added it to the pile of finished work. He then gave the pile to his current guard, the wolf, who had been standing in the corner of the room. The two people behind him had said something about dinner before leaving the room, so he wasn't going to stop them. He also didn't think he needed guards in his office when there were wolves all over his bigger apartment who could come to his aid at any time. "Please take this to Mai's office," he asked, even though he knew that any request he made to a wolf would be taken as an order. "Somewhere in the middle of the stack is fine, but if you have more time, feel free to work it in more thoroughly. If we can help it, I'd like to keep her from finding out." The wolf nodded to show that he got it, then took the papers and left. The Odo forces and their leader didn't pose a threat to his lord, and even if this genin tried something, he was sure that his lord could handle it. He would also tell some of the other wolves on the way out, just in case. When she realized she was alone with him, she seemed to feel a little better, but she still tried to avoid his eyes. He told her, "Good evening, Tsuchai-san. How are you doing today?" "All right, Naruto-sama," he said. She hadn't moved from the doorway yet, so he quickly opened the door. "I think it's about time for a break," he said, stretching a little and tossing his pen onto his desk. "Come in, and we can talk for a little while." "Of course, Naruto-sama." Her voice, which was still a little shy, got a lot more confident, and she lifted her face to give him a small smile. He was sure she was trying to be sultry, but it must have been his imagination. Even though it didn't really work, it was kind of cute. That thought was backed up by the way she sashayed, or tried to sashay. She wasn't quite there yet, but she did a very good job. He was sure that Kiba would have been all over her, and even Shino would have noticed. Actually, he should try to get back in touch with his old classmates. If someone became Chunin, there was a chance that he would be put on that team, even if it was just for the next exams. To his desk. He had to blink twice before he realized she was already at his desk, leaning forward to show off her growing bust. He knew she was moving, but his thoughts were so busy that he didn't really remember seeing her make her way over. He really hoped he hadn't looked like he was too interested in what she was doing or that he wasn't interested at all. Even though Kin was cute, she wasn't in the same league as some of the other women he hung out with, like Yuzuki Yugao, Mitarashi Anko, Uchiha Makoto, and even Orochimaru. Mai was cute, too, but she and Kin both had a long way to go before they could even think about competing with those four. Then again, Mai was likely to grow up to be a very Makoto-like beauty on her own, while he thought Kin would be more like Tatsuki and that he would be a simple beauty. He hadn't thought about that person in a while. He had to go see her grave as soon as possible. Even as he turned his attention back to Kin, he noticed that thinking about Tatsuki wasn't as painful as it used to be. Most likely, that was a good thing. He didn't waste any time getting to the point because he was happy to be in charge. "What is it that I can help you with, Tsuchai-san?" The way her lips turned down a little when he called her that, and the way her fingers started making shapes on his desk, reminded him a lot of Orochimaru, who had done the same thing just a few hours earlier. He wondered if she knew how much they were alike. "Oh, Naruto-sama, you're so nice to offer help so easily," she said. Even if she noticed that his eyebrow kept going up as she talked, she didn't say anything about it or let it take her attention away from her goal. "I'm sure you've seen Dasu and Zaku, my other two teammates, by now, right? I'm familiar with them." His tone was so dry that she must have known her approach was having little to no effect on him, but she kept going anyway, either in the hopes that it would suddenly work or to avoid having to change her approach in the middle of the conversation. "Well, Dasu is a great teammate. We get along great, and I know he's got my back," she said after pausing to look at his face. The sharply polite, just interested enough to show that they wanted to know what you were really trying to say look he wore was not at all encouraging. Zaku, on the other hand, is far too unreliable and, as you may have noticed, prone to doing things that are both rash and stupid. These are bad traits for a shinobi and a very bad thing for his teammates. She paused again, looking for some sign that he was really listening, which he gave easily. "Go on." "Well, Dasu and I talked about it, and we'd like to replace him on the team, but we don't know who to replace him with." And she stifled her nerves and moved on to what she really wanted. "You seem to be in charge of a lot of skilled wolves, and we'd love to have one on our team." She had moved around the right side of his desk, leaning into him with her growing bust and resting her right hand on his right thigh. "I know I would be very, very grateful if you gave us one of your wolves for our team to use until the next Chunin exam," she said. Before he could answer, she moved forward, trying to give him as many reasons to say yes as she could before he could even think about saying no. "And if it's about payment, well," she leaned in close and whispered as her lips touched his ear, "I'm sure we could come to an agreement about something private between the two of us, even if it takes us a few long nights to do so." Okay, maybe a little less Orochimaru and a little more Anko, but he knew she was a snake, just like the other two. He also had to admit that she did pretty well. After that, he was sure she could have charmed any male genin and a lot of younger chunin. He wasn't one of them, which was bad news for her. That doesn't mean that he was just going to say no, though. She wanted something, and it was clear that she was willing to do what it took to get it. He wouldn't be able to say how much of a sacrifice it was, if it was even a sacrifice and not just a bonus for her, which was a good thing given her job. Orochimaru should be very happy with this one. Well, if she knew that one of her subordinates was coming on to her Crimson Prince for any reason, she would probably be more angry than proud. He couldn't say for sure, but he was pretty sure she wouldn't be happy, even if Kin was just trying to take care of his needs or whatever other reason would work best. Now, if Naruto had talked to Kin about any needs, he was pretty sure she would not like it, but she would let it go. He noticed that she seemed very possessive of him. If she had been able to seduce him, that wouldn't be good for Kin or one of his wolves. Getting chased by an angry Orochimaru was way too much for a wolf to do, especially if they asked him to do it. He thought that if they could convince a wolf to join them and the wolf asked for permission to do so, they would get it almost right away. And given how much the wolves like to help, he was sure it wouldn't be hard to find someone who would do it. "Your offer is interesting, Tsuchai-san," he said in a calm voice that showed he didn't care what she did. "I don't think Orochimaru would be happy to hear about it," she said. She stiffened right away and took a sharp breath, showing that she had missed that rather important detail. "Still," he said next, "you make a good point, and I'm sure we could work out a deal to give you a wolf for the next 7 months. How strange that she was now so worried about him agreeing to find a way for her to get what she wanted. The girl looked scared, but she had good reason to be. Orochimaru was not someone you wanted to cross, and getting in the way of her and her Crimson Prince was the worst thing you could do. Now that he was willing to make a deal, she had to choose between risking Orochimaru's anger by going through with it or risking her own anger by denying her godson something he seemed to want. In either case, she was in a bad spot, and that didn't even take into account the fact that she was now completely at his mercy, and she knew it. Even if she hadn't been before, Orochimaru probably would have let him do whatever he wanted with the genin team. If she hadn't, he would have only had to accuse one of the genin and she would have been furious with them right away. In this case, though, the Oto genin was more aware of how much power he had over her, and it was all because of something she did. So, she was lucky that Naruto didn't really have anything against her and was more amused than angry by her attempt. If he hadn't spent so much time with Kunoichi at the Jounin and Sannin levels, he was sure she would have been able to do something. He thought it was her bad luck. Now then, he thought out loud, "What is it that I might want from you?" She was getting more and more nervous, and the poor girl was starting to shake. He tried to make her feel better by gently pulling her into his lap, but it didn't seem to help. He was pretty sure that he had actually made things worse. He wasn't very good at talking to normal people. Being a daimyo and all, he should probably work on that. "Let's see, you want one of my wolves, but I know for a fact that they're better than you, so asking for 7 months of service from you in exchange wouldn't be fair to me. And if I ever needed your services, I would just have to ask Orochimaru." That seemed to work a little bit, as he felt her relax just a little bit. Either his talking got in the way of her thinking, or she thought that it did. In either case, she wasn't shaking as much. "I could charge you the standard rates, but I doubt you could pay them as a genin. We could set up a payment plan, but I know that Otagakure doesn't have a lot of steady work, so that's not a good idea." This was strange for a shinobi village, but that's what happens when your main goal is to pay for Orochimaru's plans. "I don't really need a cook, and I don't know how well you can cook. The wolves usually keep the apartment clean, so I can't offer any work in that area." Orochimaru said, "Most of you are trained in at least one instrument, but I don't want a personal musician." His eyes drifted down to his paperwork. Well, Mai's paperwork, but it was all his in the end. Tell me, Tsuchai-san, do you have any organizational skills?" Back in Nami no Kuni, Hana had set up a job for Tsunami to help her with office work. "Who knows? No. Damn, I'll think about that anyway," he said after a pause. "Then again, you're borrowing a wolf until the next Chunin exam, which I assume you want to take to become a Chunin. I need to find you something that would fit an Otagakure Chunin." He didn't need assassins because the wolves were taking care of that, and he didn't need to be escorted because he wasn't delivering anything important. Protection for VIPs. To whom could he give them? Oh, that last one was actually great. Even though he had wolves to do the same thing, he thought she would probably like someone closer to her age, especially if they were trying to keep her out of the public eye until things calmed down. He thought, though, that her sister could also use another young woman to talk to. On the other hand, she already had people she could talk to outside of the wolves. Yes, this was just right. "Aw, here we go," he said. Kin was still sitting on his lap, but she didn't look like she would run away at the first chance. Good, because he liked touching people and she was the only one in the room. "I should have a long-term protection detail that I could use you for. You'll have 7 months to pay back the wolf for his help, and if you become a chunin, we can talk about getting you a more permanent job through Otagakyur." She blinked in surprise, but he couldn't see it. Well, that was a surprise. At first glance, it seemed like he had actually come up with a good, professional arrangement for them that was more than fair. A direct return of time with a suggestion for a job. If this worked out, she would get a promotion and work at her new level all the time. She couldn't have asked for anything better, as long as she didn't want to kill the person she was supposed to be protecting, of course. It was the only real problem she could think of, and it was the only thing that made her think twice. She asked, "What if the client doesn't like me? Since I'm the client, I don't think so." Her face turned bright red, and she was so glad he couldn't see it. Either she would be protecting him, which would mean spending a lot of time close to him, at least 7 weeks and possibly as long as he needed protecting, if she could make chunin, or he would say he cared about her, which was ridiculous since they barely knew each other. "Of course," he said next, waking her up from her thoughts. "The VIP I need you to watch may be hard to get along with. She's the heiress of a powerful clan in Konoha, so she's used to being in charge. There may be some trouble between you." Her blush went from being embarrassed by the situation to being embarrassed by the assumptions she made. She also couldn't get rid of the small ache of disappointment. "Luckily, we have a chance to make sure this plan will work," he said, as if he had no idea how bad things were for her. Even though he couldn't see her face, that seemed pretty likely. "We can call it a test run if you want, but I'll soon need to make sure she's safe, and we may need to keep her out of sight of the public. I think you would do a better job than some of my wolves," she said, really, and hoped that her voice hadn't been too high-pitched. "Yes, like me, the wolves aren't the best at social interaction. She's used to having people to boss around, and the rest of the guards I'll give her should act similarly, except that she won't be able to tell them what to do against my orders. I think she may need protection that can give her better social interactions while she's away from the world. Having a young woman like you around to talk to should help. So I'll watch over her for a while and then you'll give us the wolf. Yes, after the next chunin exams, you can pay me back by guarding the same VIP for 7 months. After that, we can talk about the possibility of a longer-term job doing the same thing. Sounds good to me." She was pretty sure that if either of them was getting a better deal out of this, it was her. "And what if I don't get along well with your VIP? I'll talk to her, so she should be willing to work with you. But if there's a big problem that keeps you from working together, we'll have to find something else for you to do. If things look too bad during this trial run, I'd suggest coming up with other plans." "Okay, then I think we have an agreement, Naruto-sama. Thank you very much for helping me with this." "Yes, we do, Tsuchai-san, and it was no trouble at all." "Well, it was a little trouble, but it was important to be polite most of the time. You would think this was a good way to handle informal, friendly negotiations." After making a deal, they both went quiet. Naruto didn't mind at all. His left arm was reaching for the next piece of paper on his desk, and his right arm was still wrapped around Kin's middle as he held her on his lap. Kin, on the other hand, didn't feel so good about where she was. Her eyes kept darting to the door, as if Orochimaru could walk in at any moment. She didn't say anything right away, though. 1 minute went by, and then 2. A young woman wriggled restlessly in the lap of the moon god as papers moved across the dark grain of a heavy desk. Naruto-sama?" she asked, both terrified and embarrassed by the attention and physical touch. He didn't even look at her. "Are we done with the talks?" He agreed by saying HM. Then, were you going to let me go?" He paused, turned to look at her questioningly, and briefly pulled her closer to him with his right arm, as if to make sure he was really holding her. "Do I really have to?" No, not really." She couldn't make him do anything, so her answer was more of a question than a statement. "HM," he said, and turned back to his papers while still holding her with his right arm, as if the matter was over. She thought it had been for him. With a small sigh, she was reminded that she had no control over the situation. She decided to give up and just let herself relax against him. She was still a little nervous and afraid that her mistress would catch her, but she liked being held on his lap. She would just have to hope that Naruto would protect her if Orochimaru came through the door before she could get away. A pleasant shiver went down her spine. There was an idea. Kin Tsuchai, an Otagakyur genin, had to give up everything and trust the daimyo of Nami no Kuni with her safety. It was new, she was scared, which made it a little bit exciting. And she had never felt so at ease as she did now. She thought that if her ill-thought-out plan from earlier had worked, it could have been the plot for Jiraiya's next Ika book. With a new blush on her face, she pressed herself more into his chest on purpose, as if she wanted to hide from her own thoughts, and she liked how his body felt against hers. But if anyone called it cuddling, she would strongly deny it.
I will continue the story in next part. Till then, we weeb offline.